This link is for fourth grade, going along with the story History at Your Feet. You're going to be referencing your hardcover treasure textbook on page 344 and 345. I hope that you would follow along with me as I read this story so that you guys can reference to what I'm talking about. Now, before I actually start into the story, I'd like to go over the vocabulary words that we're going to find in this particular unit. And the first one is sores. Now, if someone has sores on his body, he has places on his skin that are broken and painful. We clean the dog's sores and put bandages on them. Loosened. If you loosened something, you made it less tight. Dad loosened his tie when he left work. If something is mysterious, it is hard to understand or explain. The woods seem dark and mysterious in the moonlight. Amazement. When something creates amazement, it causes surprise and wonder. We stared in amazement at the acrobats far above us. Midst. If you're in the midst of something, you're in the middle of it. In the midst of our social studies lesson, the fire drill began. Responsibility. Having a responsibility means having a job or duty to perform. Clearing the table after supper is my responsibility. And then finally, patchwork. Things that are made of patchwork are made of small pieces of fabric. The patchwork quilt was handed down in my family. Now go ahead and turn your attention to page 344 so that we can talk a little bit about this story. And of course, before we get started, I want to talk about a dictionary strategy that you need to be focusing on as you're doing reading and trying to understand vocabulary words that you're not quite sure what the meaning of those are. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about homophones. Now, homophones sound the same, but they have different spellings and different meanings. For example, the words sores and sores are homophones. But remember the word sores, S-O-R-E-S, that is an actual place on the skin where it's broken or painful. Whereas S-O-A-R-S means flying above, so like the eagle soars in the sky. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the story, History at Your Feet. It's by Andre Melillo. Do I have to go? Sam asked. Look, I've got sores on my feet from walking so much. Sam, his sister Kim, and their family were on their way to the Pawnee Indian Village Museum. Mom gave Sam some bandage strips and said, You'll enjoy learning about the people of the Pawnee Nation. Letting out a big sigh, Sam loosened his sandal straps and trudged out of the car. Who were the Pawnee? The origins of the Pawnee tribe are mysterious. In the early 1800s, there were 10,000 to 30,000 Pawnees living in 4 separate bands. This museum is located where one band of Pawnees settled back in 1820, explained Mom. We're standing exactly where the Pawnees lived, exclaimed Kim in amazement. That's right, said Dad. Here's part of the original floor, he said, pointing. You can see some burned timbers from the fire that destroyed the village. What was life like? Now, Sam had to admit that being in the midst of all the history was exciting. What was it like to live back then, he wondered aloud. A museum guide spoke up. It happens to be my responsibility to tell you just that. The Pawnee hunted mostly buffalo and used every part of the animal they killed for food or clothing. They let nothing go to waste. Clothing, said Kim. Buffaloes aren't shaped like any clothing I've seen. Everyone chuckled. They'd sew a patchwork of pieces into the warm winter robes and pants, exclaimed the guide. And now what we're going to talk a little bit about is our comprehension strategy that we're going to work on this week. That strategy we're working on is sequencing. Now, when you summarize a story, it includes the most important events in sequence. And sequence is the order in which events in a story take place. Now, events in a story usually occur in time order. That is, you read about the earliest events first, and you follow along until the last events occur at the end. But sometimes the events are told out of order, but the author usually gives you clues to help you recognize what the sequence truly is. Now, to identify sequence as you read, you want to look for signal words or phrases, things such as the words first, next, last, then, or finally. These are words that help you summarize the sequence of events. Now, with that being said, we're going to reread the story History at Your Feet. And as we're rereading the story, we're going to use a sequence chart that's going to help us sequence the events of the story. All right, so let's go ahead and refer back to page 344. Do I have to go? Sam asked. Look, I've got sores on my feet from walking so much. Sam, his sister Kim, and their family were on their way to the Pawnee Indian Village Museum. Mom gave Sam some bandage strips and said, "You'll enjoy learning about the people of the Pawnee Nation." Letting out a big sigh, Sam loosened his sandal straps and trudged out of the car. Now, it seems as if Sam's family has been sightseeing on foot as the story begins, because Sam complains about having walked too much. Now, the first event is the family's discussion about going to their next destination, which is the Pawnee Indian Village Museum. Now, I can place that information in my sequence chart as the first sequenced event. And we're going to say the family discusses their next destination. All right, let's continue to read. Who were the Pawnee? Now, the origins of the Pawnee tribe are mysterious. In the early 1800s, there were 10,000 to 30,000 Pawnees living in 4 separate bands. This museum is located where one band of the Pawnees settled back in 1820, explained Mom. We're standing exactly where the Pawnees lived, explained Kim in amazement. That's right, said Dad. Here is part of the original floor, he said, pointing. You can see some burned timbers from the fire that destroyed the village. Now let's take some time and reflect about what we just read. Now what I just read about was, they're at the museum. And because they're at the museum, Mom's explaining where the museum is. Kim is excited about the museum, and Dad points out the original floor and the burned timbers. Okay, so that right now is telling us that the family is at the museum and that they're beginning to learn. So that's going to be our next sequence of event. At the museum, the family begins to learn. What was life like? Now, Sam had to admit that being in the midst of all this history was exciting. What was it like to live back then, he wondered aloud. Okay, so now at that point in time, we finally have Sam enjoying his trip. Okay, and so that's going to be the next sequence of events, that Sam admits that he is interested. Okay, and we know he's interested because he's actually excited. He's actually asking questions out loud. Okay, and with that being said, let's keep reading. A museum guide spoke up. It happens to be my responsibility to tell you just that. The Pawnee hunted mostly buffalo and used every part of the animal they killed for food or clothing. They let nothing go to waste. Clothing, said Kim. Buffaloes aren't shaped like any clothing I've ever seen. Everyone chuckled. They'd sew a patchwork of pieces into the warm winter robes and pants, explained the guide. Okay, and so finally at the end, we're realizing that the museum guide explains about the Pawnee's way of life. So the museum guide is explaining the Pawnee way of life. Okay, now that is going to go ahead and conclude us referencing to the end, or to the story of how to sequence events. But realize that your responsibility for today is going to be page 96, which is referencing those vocabulary words we went over at the beginning of this link. And then, of course, tomorrow you are going to be referencing how to sequence of events. And remember, when you're sequencing events, you want to look for those signal words and phrases such as first, next, then, last, and finally. If you have further questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact me.